Kirby Superstar Ultra is one of the most beloved, if not the most beloved title in the series and substitutes as the perfect poster child how a faithful remake should look like, with a couple self-contained adventures and even more modes in the remake. It's self-explanatory to fight all sorts of different enemies, new and old, since the remake only adds a handful new foes and only alters known bosses very slightly. I decided to put both the remake and the original together, but will take the original's accomplishments into consideration and do not judge those bosses based on the standard when the remake released. Since this game features the most Kirby bosses of any Kirby game, there's no time to waste and rank over 15 bosses of Kirby Superstar Ultra. As I explained in the introduction, Superstar isn't structured like a traditional platformer and offers multiple experiences based on a certain unique premise. To have a gentle approach to the game, the very first mode resembles a remake of the original's Kirby's Dream Land for the Game Boy, hence presenting those bosses nearly untouched. This is why Krakow, as well as some following enemies in this list, remain so low, because there's simply not too much new to talk about. Krakow dashes, shoots thunderbolts and drops enemies just like in the original, and while the harder counterpart introduced in the second half of the game is not as brutal as in the Origins Extra mode, it's probably more suitable for the modern zeitgeist of Kirby. Still, I'm glad they even implemented those difficult variations this time, and there's nothing wrong seeing classic Kirby enemies with a pleasing pixel art style. Just like Krakow, the twins are basically the same fight, like in Dreamland, but I haven't mentioned one essential difference to the original. This is a modern Kirby title. What I mean by that are copy abilities, a feature missing in the original, making every boss way easier than before. This is only partially true in this case, as the battlefield is heavily restricted thanks to the tight layout that once emphasized the projectile-based fighting style of Kirby. You don't need to inhale the twins' blocks anymore, and the whole dynamic of the battle changes therefore. It might sound negative, but I'm not implying this is a bad decision, since you can perceive it as interesting to encounter those bosses with modern skills. Besides, the harder counterparts of the twins explore the idea of increasing the difficulty way better than Krakow by adding an additional layer and Gordos to increase the pressure. Unlike with Krakow, it's not nearly the identical battle and noticeably changed, giving the twins a fitting contemporary twist to their premise. Following the original's Dreamland boss quartet, Wispy obviously has to follow and is easier than ever before. Normally you would have to wait for some apples to shoot back, giving the battle a little room to breathe, but just like I mentioned with the twins, having a powerful ability ends the fight in an instance. It's not as bad as in today's games, since Superstar as well as the remake have the small trick to deal damage in very brief intervals instead of consistently. In today's games you can inflict damage to your opponent as long as you perform some kind of attack, but in this game's case there's always this little gap to at least give the enemy somewhat of a chance to strike back. Of course, this doesn't make Wispy any harder, and the only reason why this tree is even higher than the former bosses is Twin Wispy. During the events of Metanite's revenge, you are going to drop from the ship and land on the surface again, encountering Wispy a second time. This time, however, you have to face off two Wispies at each side of the arena, and while it does not really change the way you brawl, it's at least a little surprise you may not see coming. Moreover, having two opponents does underline the multiplayer of the game, and if you venture with another player, everyone can target a foe to fight. Concluding the Dreamland Quartet, Kabula plays out a little differently from those other bosses. Initially a regular foe on your way through Dreamland, the original superstar does not include Kabula in its short mini remake of the first Kirby game, and we should have to wait until its remake to get a proper revenge of DDD's grinning airship. Before entering Mount DDD, Kabula takes you down from the sky only to be rescued by the starship you used to fight Nova. The accompanying urgent music, a little cutscene before the fight, and overall atmosphere conveys a surprising sense of tension and feels unnecessarily climactic, therefore extremely exciting. You get the impression it was always like that in the original, and giving the starship one last shot during the post-game makes everything feel a little more rounded. Fighting Kabula per se is very similar to Dreamland, with some quick dashes and consistent firepower from the enemy's side. In fact, it's even easier thanks to the power of the starship, and even though the battle could have handled an upgrade as well, Kabula is without a doubt the best improved original boss while staying very classic. The final boss of Metanite's revenge and leader of the Halbert, Metanite, awaits you as your last opponent in this fast-paced, action-packed mode. Coming straight from adventure, Metanite established himself as one of Kirby's all-stars and wants to test Dreamland's resistance by starting a great offensive. Countless foes and obstacles later, it seems like there's no hope for the ship itself left, but a fair duel to find out if Kirby can also overcome the Halbert's true core. Using the sword you are offered, the battle against Metanite is fundamentally akin to adventure, with new moves, a better sense of difficulty and unique music. A special shout out to the wacky design of the original superstar, with Metanite being a little bigger than his adventure counterpart, but still not as refined as the remake's model, for example. Every new skill like the tornado is still used to this day, and although it's hard to explain, it feels like his behavior is far more fair to predict while remaining challenging. The fight itself is not what makes this encounter so iconic, but culmination of everything you have seen in this mode before, and even after you win the duel, there's still a short chasing sequence trying to escape the crumbling Halbert and dodging Metanite's last attempts to stop you. From the beginning to the end, Metanite's Revenge remains to be one of the best modes the game has to offer, and even though there's no Halbert left to win Dreamland over, it was enough to obtain a Grammy. The first proper original boss and one of Metanite's defense system guarding his giant battleship, the Halbert. After causing serious damage, the reactor is the last remaining machine to take, and therefore incredibly important for Metanite's goal of assaulting Dreamland. What I enjoy not only about this construct, but the upcoming combo cannon as well, is how these are not characterized with eyes, floating arms or similar design patterns you see in Kirby games. It's a cold machine without any expressions, which leads to a very specific strategy to win. Unlike with most bosses, you cannot permanently deal harm and have to direct the reactor's lasers coming from small devices to the core crystal, providing the Halbert with necessary energy. Luckily, the laser bounces from corner to corner, making a task that could become frustrating fairly bearable with the right sense of direction. Naturally, there has to be a challenge, and fire from below or powerful flamethrowers at the front force you to either stand in the right place or make a quick jump to dodge. Although it's not necessary, you can actually destroy the flamethrower at the front, which is not linked to the health bar of the boss, but nonetheless an appreciated detail. It makes the overall boss fight more complex and gives you something to do while waiting for the next laser to come. Having those optional parts to take out reminds me of Star Fox, where a lot of bosses have those additional weak points attached to their body, sometimes implemented for a quicker way to deal damage or simply make the boss weaker. Robotic enemies obviously offer themselves greatly for such a feature, and I wish more modern Kirby bosses would think about this idea again. The first of many bosses you will face in the Great Cave Offensive, a short self-contained open world mode with countless treasures. This side adventure is structured into different areas for you to explore, each of them containing one boss at the end of the road. Chameleo Arm is one of them, a cheeky little creature able to adjust to his surroundings and make himself nearly invincible. Armored with small claws and a long tongue, this boss feels particularly unique, since there was never a foe playing with your ability to recognize your adversary properly. Of course, this isn't as hard as I make it out to be, and no matter which copy ability you carry, there are enough chances to strike from the ground or the air. It's a trend you're going to see from all of those bosses coming from the underground, but I'm glad they focused to make each of them distinct and individual enough to clearly differentiate them in terms of gameplay, design and general atmosphere. Probably the most disappointing yet promising encounter in the game. This sentence alone should create some confusion, considering the relatively high placement in contrast to how many bosses there are, but it's more like a mismatch between the amazing design as well as potential to actual fight. Coming straight after the tutorial mode of the game, Dino Blade's mode doesn't increase the challenge too much and focuses on a traditional platformer adventure, with the classic level selection screen similar to a Mario title. At the end waits a proud mother, eager to defend her children and misunderstand the situation. If you have watched the animation show or played Air Ride, you are probably aware how powerful this Iron Bird is normally portrayed. Yes, those representatives only appeared after this game, and it's unfair to judge something based on a future it was not aware of. But even in Superstar, Dino Blade is shown to be a more than capable fighter. The way she dashes from the background in combination with the scratchy sound effect demonstrates her speed, and thanks to the armor, you can only damage by hitting her head. For a beginner, this fight could give you some trouble considering how there's not much space to hide and Dino Blade switching positions consistently. For a basic first encounter, this would have been more than fine, but strangely enough, Dino Blade is one of the very few bosses in this game to not receive a harder counterpart in the remake. A clear missed chance to underline her true strength. It's even worse that, to this day, this is the only proper Dino Blade battle in the series, and despite the fact she only occasionally appears in modern titles as an Easter egg, many newer fans still know about her existence, proving the impression she left on players. Something about her design strikes a perfect balance between colorful without appearing ridiculous, and I'm more than certain that one day she's going to cross the sky of Dreamland again. It feels a little contradicting to say regarding the friendly design, but Fatty Whale poses one of the dangers awaiting you in the grounds of the Great Cave Offensive. The blue whale, proud to make a huge splash with his massive body, can be more difficult than you would expect, regarding how the main damage you're going to take is probably going to happen thanks to touching his body. With a boss like that, you would expect him to remain mainly in the background and maybe show his head occasionally, but it's the complete opposite. Coming from left to right, appearing in the middle, using water to break down rocks, or simply throwing you into the air, are all skills surprisingly elaborated for not being the main adversary of the mode. And because this is a 2D game placed on a console only able to mainly portray 2D graphics, the creators did a tremendous job in showing Fatty Whale from all those angles, making him way more flexible than he has any right to be. The foreplay to the true climax and cause of Marx's overwhelming power, Galactic Nova. This comet was summoned after Kirby's exhausting excursion through the galaxy and should have been the reason to end the Sun and Moon's conflict, the seed of this adventure. Before taking out Marx personally, Kirby has to stop Nova with the help of Sun and Moon, entering the wish-granting star with a starship, and naturally including a, at this point in the series, classic shmup section. By destroying each core of each pillar, Nova will be stopped for a moment and you can even see your progress in the background, cementing forgetting the fact that you're flying repeating rounds. For a Super Nintendo game, every implementation of the background is heavily appreciated. And even though the fight itself doesn't offer much variety or challenge, since it is the introduction to the final, there's still the attempt to differentiate this shmup boss from others you have seen before. The last foe on your quest to find every treasure, Wham Bam Rock uses his rock-solid hands and unearthly grin to offer a boss fight, unlike to everyone else in a game full of individual opponents. Despite the giant appearance of a golem, it's only the hands which are going to participate as your enemy, and in classic Nintendo boss fashion, also the weak points. They travel through the arena by walking on their fingers, clutch a fist, let some rocks fall, or try to grab Kirby. Mechanically, there aren't really interesting ideas going on, although the premise seems particularly unique. The main challenge comes from avoiding attacks while trying to hit, and even though the golem is far from difficult, it's still a fitting final test before ending the Great Cave offensive. I would even claim it's unfair to judge this boss on its own. It's a great luxury to receive so many unlike bosses in a singular mode, and the golem is the only icing on the cake. Still, if this is not enough, there's actually an additional secret boss in the remake when playing the Halbert arena. After going through every major boss, you meet the crystallized version of Wham Bam Rock, which sounds fancier than it actually is. Every technique is noticeably faster and all of your efforts are not as powerful as before. It's commendable to have one last surprise for the helpers as well, giving them a special encounter and celebrating one of Superstar Ultra's best modes again. Another one of the Halbert's impressive mechanical constructions and main means for the offensive. The combo cannon is yet another soulless machine and fires with bombs and an unobtrusive yet huge laser from the front. You have to attack the main cannon at the top while watching out for a slow arm coming from above throwing bombs at you. Once again, there are a couple of targets to hit, like the aforementioned arms or laser cannon in front of you. Since you do not have to wait for a beam to appear and can attack the main cannon whenever you like, it's not really smart to waste time and go for optional hurdles, but more entertaining if you want to increase the challenge personally. The only reason why I enjoy the combo cannon more than the reactor is simply the order in which they appear and their execution. The reactor comes after the combo cannon and is a neat last stretch to make you feel like you destroyed the Halbert on your own, but the foundation is very similar to the combo cannon and basically a reskin. Furthermore, maneuvering lasers to your target sounds harder than it is, and I find the combo cannon to be a little more difficult and pleasant, being able to strike whenever you like. As I stated, to this day, we do not really fight mere objects anymore, and you could consider all of those industrial menaces to be one unified boss on its own, the Halbert. After traveling through Dreamland, different galaxies and battling dangerous foes, Metanite reaches the end of his adventure and just like Marx is granted one wish to come true. Unlike the power-hungry maniac, however, Metanite does not thirst for fame, energy or wealth, but has only one wish he previously tried to compensate with Kirby, fighting the strongest warrior in the galaxy. Entering the top 5 of the Superstar Ultra bosses, there are only slight details in differentiating the quality between those behemoths. Galactic Knight starts with his debut in this remake resembling the final boss of Metanite's very own campaign. Today, this legendary opponent doesn't leave as much of an impression as in the past, especially with the everlasting presence of Morpho Knight, but having another knight similar to the Lonely Swordsman was such an interesting idea, considering how no one expected such an elaborated new final boss. What's even more is how Galactic Knight's design mirrors the childlike design of the franchise with his friendly color palette, dodging the edgy style Dark Meta Knight was going for. Still, his flashy pink in combination with the striking eyes create a certain sense of intimidation which is reflected in every attack he performs. It would have been easy to plainly copy Metanite's battle and the Halbert and simply add 1 or 2 new attacks, but Galactic Knight is completely original and doesn't play by any rules. The snow-white wings allow him to permanently glide through the air, and the pointy lance pierces the horizon with powerful beams. Regarding how this mode is post-game content and Meta Knight's overpowered additional abilities you can perform, I feel like Galactic Knight strikes a perfect balance of difficulty, not coming across as too unfair but just fine to force you to go all out on your first try. It's the perfect reward to having to go through what can be considered the same game again, and there's a reason why this iconic knight should stay in the franchise to this day. The main antagonist of Superstar Ultra and first twisted villain when it comes to betrayal, Marx, left quite the impression on fans back in the day, and is without a doubt one of the franchise's most memorable enemies. After bringing Kirby to summon Nova, he kicks the naive hero aside and wants to become a creature full of dominance and impossible to defeat. There might have been an unexpected turn of events in Kirby's adventure prior to Superstar, but I assume no one really foresee a twist villain coming. Taking advantage of Kirby is in fact an extremely clever move, but being aware of the Pink Glutton's potential and simultaneously underestimating the very being who helped you reaching your goal is something no twist villain will ever learn. Still, there has to be a fight first, and with Marx's newly added wings and sinister laugh, you are in for one of the most iconic boss fights in the series. Judging this battle today, it's a little hard to praise the fight with a modern standard in mind. I always regarded Marx as the blueprint for any contemporary Kirby final boss, using all sorts of wacky techniques, but in former days it was a huge upgrade from all those shmup climaxes, like Dark Matter or Nightmare. On top of that, Marx's skills are simply creative, and especially on your first try, there are so many techniques you do not see coming, like the falling seeds immediately growing from below or the falling bomb splitting itself into 2 pieces. In the original, the clash already initiated an incredibly eerie aura, but the remake did a terrific job in improving on the animations, expressions and general sound design. It strikes this perfect balance of not turning too edgy but feeling uncomfortable enough to create this uncanny tone the series occasionally tends to have. There may not be a glorious finisher or anything similar, but Marx offers an amazingly solid foundation for the future to follow, and could definitely return as a devious background player, causing some shenanigans yet being wise enough to never mess with Kirby again. The main safeguard, the Heavy Lobster, always remained memorable to me, ignoring the fact it's a stylish looking robot. Its whole movement differentiates from other bosses by expressing no emotions whatsoever, and the strong mechanical footsteps make the soundtrack this boss is accompanied by feel incomplete. After all, it's not like you have to face the robotic lobster once, as there's one attempt to get rid of Kirby from the Halbert. Naturally, this was destined to fail, and after re-entering the giant battleship, it's time to settle things completely and destroy your enemy once and for all. The sequence starts with a short chasing scene, something I always appreciate as the appetizer before the fight. It's not too long to become annoying even after multiple tries, and sets Heavy Lobster up as something to be reckoned with. Surprisingly enough, the fight itself is quite simplistic, with a handful of attacks repeating themselves quickly if you take your time. Winning shouldn't pose a problem unless you want to make use of a specific gimmick, only possible in this encounter. By inhaling one of the Heavy Lobster's slimes, Kirby gains the paint ability, a one-timer skill just like Crash, but with the side effect of not destroying your opponent with one hit, but making him blind and confused. Technically, Heavy Lobster doesn't become weaker, as all of his techniques stay the same, but it feels like the AI doesn't function properly anymore, and it's genuinely a pleasant Easter egg to make sure the battle receives a memorable factor. I wish more modern bosses would inherit a special way of defeating your foe, and Heavy Lobster perfectly shows that it doesn't have to make the fight significantly easier, but plainly turning the events into a different direction is arguably even more worth the inclusion. It may sound like an exaggeration, but the computer virus is not only one of the best bosses in this game, but one of my biggest favorites in the series. Everyone who played the game is most likely familiar with the special concept of this boss, but for all the people who want to understand the gist in one simple sentence, it's an RPG boss put into a platformer. Like most bosses in this list, there are different variations of this encounter, but every time you fight the computer virus, you have to defeat 3 enemies in a row and bring their health points to 0. A text box at the top comments on the events, tells you when to attack and when your enemy strikes, as well as congratulating you on your win. Each opponent can only perform a handful skills to not oversell their welcome, and you get even a nice indicator on how much damage each of your attack deals. This could be considered a hot take, since on regular playthroughs it can be annoying to go through all those little comments and the whole fight feels rather slow once the surprise dwindles. Still, it's an extremely creative take on the genre, especially for the first time when the original Superstar released, and I would love to see more of those strange, unexpected foes in future titles. Initially, it might appear like a surprise for everyone who played the game to put a boss like DDD on the first place in a ranking full of memorable encounters. Just like the first placings, the original DDD Brawl is simply a remake of the original Dreamland, but way easier and overall beginner friendly. While this aspect of the fight doesn't sit quite right with me, the visuals are massively upgraded, and although you battled in an arena before, this time the whole scenario is much more elaborated, with striking colors and a proper audience. DDD himself looks extremely detailed and expressive thanks to the masterful pixel animations, mirroring the same amount of power they used back in the day to make the original DDD just as punchy. For a remake, they probably couldn't have done better, but all of this would not justify the first place. Superstar Ultra introduces a couple of new adventures, and one of those is Revenge of the King, a mode similar to Revenge of the Metanite, but being based on the extra mode of the very first Kirby's Dreamland. This is also where you fight all those harder versions of known enemies I mentioned at the beginning of the video, but the true highlight is obviously the King himself. At the end of this difficult excursion, you find yourself in an empty arena with only one viewer, the battleground being closed by an electrified cage. Unlike with the only slightly altered, harder counterparts of former bosses, DDD truly wants to step up his game, armors himself with an iron mask, an upgraded version of his trusty hammer. What follows is a clash between rivals unseen for the franchise before, where Kirby is going to be bombarded with heavy swings, rockets and claustrophobic atmosphere. Obviously, it's still a far cry from a serious challenge, and it will most likely not take you more than 2 tries, but Kirby games never have to be seriously brutal in their difficulty, and Mask DDD strikes this perfect balance of keeping your eyebrows high without breaking your controller. The number of details are similarly important to notice, with DDD offering you a hammer before fighting, making the fight easier but equitable, while Bandana watches as the only viewer from behind. Gameplay wise, the cage is a brilliant way to higher the stakes, since you are not allowed to fly endlessly and dodge every attack. Instead, you have to keep a certain height, adding a little dexterity to the battle and incorporating something I would like to see be implemented more often into bosses, Kirby's floating ability. Even if all of this is still not convincing, it's not only about the fray itself. Until the release of Superstar Ultra, players fought countless DDD battles, and it must be always hard to come up with a new idea or concept as to why DDD acts villainous in the first place. Longtime viewers probably already know my stance towards friendly DDD, but I always enjoyed his cunning side way more, even if his motives are as simple as stealing food. So having this personal, intense rivalry being played out in such a face-to-face manner, without any unnecessary worlds and scenario, is so much more impactful for those two characters that do not need to despise each other to bonk their hammers. All it takes is the main hero and the main antagonist of the series to finish a game, or in this case, mode, and it's not without a reason that Mask DDD remains to be DDD's most memorable showdown in the franchise. It would have been a shame to leave out this iconic battle considering how Superstar Ultra contributed a fair share of recognition to someone who's considered as one of the main cast of the series. Bandana Waddle Dee, or simply Bandana D, assists King DDD in Revenge of the King and banters with him throughout the mode. It's mostly panicking as Kirby steamrolls through every obstacle, and after there's no hope left, the brave Waddle Dee takes his destiny in his hands and does everything to protect his king. Naturally, this battle is not a serious showdown and instead a mere regular enemy encounter with a boss health bar. He has no spears or umbrellas from modern titles and plainly walks towards Kirby with the confidence every final boss would bow to. Although Bandana D receives no options to harm Kirby, I still appreciate how they gave him his own health bar, showing how this Waddle Dee is a little above a regular one. Even after defeating this intimidating opponent, he still cheers for King DDD during the climax, proving how he is not only loyal to Kirby in modern titles, but will never forget where he came from. Despite Superstar's short length and only handful of modes, the original already offered a great variety of different unique boss fights, iconic to this day. The remake only added to this iconic number and almost perfected, a formula people are still praising. It's not without reason so many features, characters and moments are carried over to modern titles, and it's always a pleasure to start one of the many adventures again.